honor everybody's time. So we'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. Let's see, we've got, oh, let me hit this. We've got Director Bullerjack, Director Larson, Director Morris, and we're waiting on Director Carly Hoover, Director Hoover, who will hopefully be here soon. And just want to welcome our guests for your evening here with us, and Dr. Steach. We'll go ahead and move on to presentations.
Good evening. Thank you, President Apoa Ryder and directors. We have this evening for this particular work session. I'll be turning it over to Mr. Howard and Dr. Steach to present information about the ability to have a dashboard and do some monitoring of our strategic plan. This fits well with an agenda item on our board meeting a little bit later this evening. They're not dependent on each other, but I think they work well together. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Howard and Dr. Steach.
Thank you, Dr. Herndon. Good evening, board directors and Dr. Steach. I have the fondness of being able to talk to you about something that is started with Dr. Herndon in a small conversation, and it's just has grown bigger and bigger and bigger. One of the big pieces Dr. Herndon's vision is the ability to monitor and to incorporate our actual strategic plan and what we've already paid for. The directors have done a fantastic job in supporting our vision around what we would like to do to improve academic achievement for our students, and that's all students inclusive. And one of the big pieces that we've been trying to do is incorporate voice. And this conversation started last year. So it's been a work in progress. And one of the great things I love about working with the Center for Educational Effectiveness and Dr. Steach is the ability to incorporate voices, student voice, staff voice, and also take a look at what we currently have and how we can incorporate that and build on it. And so some of the things that the board has okayed for us to pay for out of budget is what we call school data sources or homeroom. And you will see throughout this process how we can incorporate the services that have been paid for already and how we want to move forward. One of the biggest pieces that you will see is formative assessment. Formative assessment is the key to making everything work, and that is collaboration with teachers to move this conversation forward, and that continues to be the things that we work on, along with using iReady as a summative assessment. After everything's been done, here's the summative assessment at the very end. I call it the bookends, but the work that goes in between that, before you get to the summative assessment, is that formative assessment that plans every 40, 45 days. Well, this actual monitoring system dashboard will allow us to look at this at a moment's notice. It'll be a document that's front-facing for our district, as well as one that's close-faced for us to take a look at, so we can go deeper or put what we want to put out to the public when we're ready to educate our public about what we're doing. And without further ado, I turn it over to John Steach, the Center for Educational Effectiveness, very steeped in what I call equity lens, as well as the ability to be inclusive of everybody's voice. And we've been doing that all of last year to this year to get to the point where what you see, you're about to see in this PowerPoint. Thank you, and turn it over to you, Dr. Steach.
Thank you, Mr. Howard, and I appreciate Dr. Herndon and the board for giving me the opportunity to speak, and also the opportunity to work with the Tukwila School District over the last year and a half, and hopefully into the future for a couple of years to come. Just to give you an idea about my background, I actually started off in education as a board member in the Richland School District for 8 years while I was working out on the Hanford site. Fell in love with education so much I went back to school, got an MBA with an emphasis in school finance and human resources, stayed in school, got a doctorate in education and my superintendent credentials. I left the board after 8 years and was hired a year later by the school district in Richland to run support services, moved to HR, eventually became deputy superintendent there. Left for a stint as superintendent in Canby, Oregon for 3 years, and then came back across the river to the Evergreen School District down in Vancouver, where I was deputy and superintendent there until about 2.5 years ago. So the whole concept of these dashboards really got started after I joined CEE, when I was trying to merge some of the work I was doing in Evergreen with implementing policy governance and looking at outcomes and connecting those outcomes to our strategic plan. And then got into a discussion with Trevor Green over in Yakima about Yakima's new strategic plan and our visualization capabilities and my experience with policy governance and outcome measurements. And so started working with them to develop a dashboard for the Yakima School District that's now expanded to where we're working with, I think it's 16 districts across the state developing dashboards. And our philosophy is we want the Dayton's, Waitsburg's, Bridgeport's, and Tukwillas of the state to be able to have the same capabilities and capacity as Spokane and Tacoma. And we know that you aren't going to have a full in-house Tableau department, but can we do this in a very cost-effective way to be able to give you some of those same type of visualizations that your administrators can dig into and peel back the onion and look at the different layers of data, and then the board can look at as key performance indicators for progress monitoring for the district and be able to share with the public. So ideally, when we get this thing completely done and aligned to the new strategic plan, you'll be able to select a few of those indicators that you think are high leverage that you want to be held accountable to and share with the public, that we can clean up and make sure they look very nice on the website, as well as having your administrators be able to continue to dig into the data. So if you want to go to the next slide. Again, I mentioned that this is really connected to the strategic plan. So this whole thing started with Ted giving me a copy of the Tukwila strategic plan, and I went through and started outlining, if I was superintendent and I was to be held accountable in a policy governance model to the outcomes of the district, here's some of the measures that I would recommend that we would put in place. So we looked those over, we massaged those, and eventually got to the point where we settled in on some measures. So if you go to the next slide, you know, one of the things that we're taking a look at is making sure that everything we do aligns with that mission, vision, board beliefs, and the actual goals themselves. And when you look at some of these elements within your district mission and vision statements, these aren't really black and white academic themes to measure all the time. And that's where creating a dashboard is much more than just saying, here's the academic measures that we know we have, and we're going to look at those academic measures. If you go to the next slide, I took this next graphic from, sorry, in PowerPoint, this is a build-in, and it actually comes from OSPI School Improvement Handbook. It's attributed to Selena and Gertz in Eppinga. And where the prism is, it actually says demographic data. And these are the 4 forms of data that we take a look at relative to school district monitoring and health. So often districts start on the right with academic, and they never get into the contextual, the perceptual, or the demographic data. But in actuality, your achievement data is more of a lagging indicator. And those leading indicators on do you have the formula in place within your school to drive continuous improvement and improve student learning really often come from the contextual, the perceptual, and the demographic data. With the demographic data, I put the prism on there because what I like to do is show that really demographic data, knowing your demographic data tells us how we want to split the data apart to make sure we're looking at all the right areas of your district that fit the students of Tukwila. So we're not leaving some groups hidden within larger data sets that might obscure how different groups of students may be responding to the systems that we have in place. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So I want to start with one example, and I'm going to do sort of a deep dive with that one example. And I also, Ted said it earlier, and Dr. Herndon did, we're here really to take a look at the format of the dashboard and give you an idea of the functionality and the way this is going to be able to put together and function. We're not really here to dive into the data per se. That would be a much longer workshop with a whole lot more detail that we can get into in the future. But for now, we're really going to be looking at the functionality. But I want to give you one example of how we take the raw data and how we start to try to boil that into a simple visualization as opposed to just presenting the raw data. So when you look at goal 1, you can see that we look at several things when you're talking about culture, equity, trust. They're really those perceptual data measures that get at that much more than an achievement data. So examples of what we wanted to look at were staff readiness to benefit gaps, cultural responsiveness, looking at students, some of those social emotional learning areas of belongingness and identity, their view of it. Do they have a supportive learning environment that they feel supports them? And do we have parent and community involvement? Additionally, looking at this, we would want to look at student discipline and be able to break that apart. So if you go to the next slide, on that readiness to benefit gap, what this slide shows you is what our actual educational effectiveness survey report looks like. So this is one of the pages directly cut and pasted out of our report. I added in 2 lines on there, those vertical red and green lines. And I put those in there because when we do debriefs and we sit down with district leadership and building leadership and start analyzing the data, we have some thresholds that we see as kind of trigger points to healthy versus somewhat unhealthy school environments. What you see here is that green line. If you go all the way down to the bottom in 2021 school year under sense of urgency, that's where we would want to see the data, where the 2 darker blue areas total to at or above 60%, and the orangish areas are going to be less than 10%. When you start to get out of balance of that, there's some indications that it gives us that things may not be functioning well between staff and building leadership. So if you look up at the next items up above under problem solving and conflict resolution, in those areas, you can see in problem solving, you're really only looking at about 34% of your staff, and this is a staff survey, feel that the school consistently talks about how to solve problems when they arise. And you have almost as many that say, we just don't talk about problems when they arise, which to me becomes problematic as, you know, somebody who works with building leaders. You want staff to think that if an issue is going to come up, that your staff is going to deal with it. So giving this type of information requires some interpretation. If we go to the next slide, I've in essence taken this data and just put it into a longitudinal form with the health indicators on the side, and you can see it's much easier to see. What this slide shows is the minimum is the lowest school in the Tukwila School District for each year. The maximum is the highest scoring school in that area, and then the blue is the district average or the district score. So here you can see under problem solving, pretty much the entire district is below that threshold, that health threshold when it comes to problem solving, considerably below when it comes to conflict resolution. And there is that sense of urgency. It's right on the borderline. So that is a positive that we could build upon in those discussions at the building level on that sense of urgency to improve. But as I've had discussions with Dr. Herndon and Mr. Howard, one of the things this tells me is that there's a potential culture in the district of, if I ignore you long enough, you'll go away because you're not going to deal with the conflict or solve the problem when it arises. And if we're going to move forward in developing a new strategic plan, to me, this is a key area that needs to improve over the upcoming year. And we've got some strategies we can work with through the strategic planning process and through analyzing the data and working with building principals to ideally get this improving to where these scores are up above 2/3 of the staff feeling that we solve problems, we resolve conflict, and there's a sense of urgency to move forward. Move to the next slide. This, you know, these 2 slides aren't directly out of our dashboard. On the readiness to change, this comes from an I versus they with staff. And we compare items in the survey where we ask staff, they respond to a statement that says, I am open to new ideas, and a statement that says, my colleagues are open to new ideas. And so that difference between the perception of themselves and how they perceive their colleagues, we have a health gap indicator on that difference around 20 to 25%. It's 20% for elementaries and 25 for secondaries. Here you can see again, you want to be below the line on this time, and a majority of the district for openness to new ideas, really all but one school, are above the line for that health indicator, indicating that staff aren't perceived by others the way they see themselves. So there's a disconnect in the way people are seeing each other, which typically comes from a communication or a trust issue. And often we work with schools that have these gap issues, and we just lay it on the table in front of the staff and say, why do you think people feel this way? What do people see, hear, and experience that makes them feel this way? And we try to surface the why behind that and address that. It might be as simple as one school we had where a staff member rose their hand in this situation and said, hey, every time I go in the staff lounge, people talk negatively about kids. And that's all I hear, because that's the only time I see them. And that school made a commitment that there would be no negative student talk in the staff lounge. And with 1 year, they dropped that gap on willingness to work at change down to well into a healthy level because of that one thing that they were able to surface about what people were seeing, hearing, and experiencing. So I'm just giving you some examples of how we use the data and how we pull this together. Now I want to move into what those actual dashboard visualizations look like in the next slide. So instead of giving Likert charts or your typical bar charts, we lay this out in a Tableau format. And here you can see this is supportive learning environment comparison. So you've got the staff, student, and parent survey components, and you've got multiple years. We can break it down by district-wide. We can break it down elementary, high school, middle school. If you go to the next slide, you can see that we can then take it and break it out by race and ethnicity for both students and parents. So you start to get an idea of who's growing, who's not growing, what trends do you have that are positive potentially, or negative trends that you need to address. And from an administrator standpoint, you can really drill into this. Again, when I talk about this being a two-facing, one for the administrators and one for the public, this isn't something you probably would put on the website, but if there's a story you want to tell out of this data, that's where we can work to customize what that view looks like and create an embed code that we can work with your web developer and then put it on the website. The beauty of some of this data, and Mr. Howard mentioned School Data Solutions, is last summer we formed a partnership with School Data Solutions to be able to help support these dashboards. So, I commend everything Tukwila has done to get the dashboards to this point in the midst of a pandemic, because I know often getting data export files to a contractor or consultant isn't probably the top priority in the last 12 months. So we've been able to make significant progress, but what we saw was maybe if we cut the district completely out of the loop of providing the data and took that onus off of them, we now have that agreement where we set up a three-way data sharing agreement. So when your iReady results are done, your window closes, it gets uploaded into School Data Solutions homeroom because they get a notice saying that the window's closed. They basically have a operations rule that runs a report for us, takes that report, puts it in a secure neutral server, and sends us a message saying our data's ready. And we can pull that data literally within hours, if not minutes, from the time that you close the iReady window, plug it into our system and be able to update that data. And it takes no effort on the part of the district. So we're about 90% complete with mapping that out with School Data Solutions. We're in the final stages and expect to have that done in January. So there's some elements that you'll see that we get into here in the data that I have this under construction, and those are data elements that we haven't been able to get from Tukwila yet, and we still haven't mapped out through School Data Solutions. But we will have those within about a month or two to be able to finalize the dashboard in the format that it's in today. Another thing that we can do with these, and I was working with Mr. Howard last summer, if you go to the next slide, is taking a look at what are the current levels of performance, what are some goals that we want to set relative to our norm data set. And here with supportive learning environment, you have all of your student groups when broken down by race and ethnicity that are actually above our standard norm reference for the entire 5-year history of the data that we do a rolling 5-year average. So this gives you an example of, if you look at that, we could set potentially a goal that we want to close that gap. And we realize that since we're already above the average of all the other schools, that not everybody may be able to keep increasing above that 86, 87% mark, but we at least want to close that gap, and we can use this data to be able to set what are those goals that we want to have for the schools moving forward. If you go to the next slide, gives us another example of parent and community involvement from a student perspective. Again, you can see we lay it out with the district values from 1920 to 2021. You see a 28% growth there. You can break it out by level and see the growth. And in this case, even by race and ethnicity, fairly consistent growth, but the lowest level of growth was with the American Indian Alaska Native students. You know, as an example, you know, at some point you may find that you have one race or ethnicity that isn't showing progress like the others, which gives you an indicator as a building administrator to say, hey, maybe I need to have a focus group and bring some students in and talk to them about, here's the way you responded in this survey. And I'm curious, what do you think made you or other students you know that are in this group, but what makes you feel that way? So that, you know, what about our systems isn't meeting your need, and how can we modify our systems to better support you? So, you know, we've got a lot of ethnicity built into this because we know that's a high priority with the Tukwila School District, but we can also break this down by gender. We can break it down by special program, federal program enrollment. Pretty much anything you have in your student record system that you mark students and track students by, we can create disaggregations according to that. If you go to the next one, we get out of, you know, the first two are more cultural elements. Now we get into a sense of belongingness, which is is really one of our definitions in our social emotional learning framework. So here you're getting an indication of how well do students feel like they belong, again, broken down by district, level, and then race and ethnicity. And you can see, again, you've got positive growth from 2019 to 2021. Because of the pandemic and the fact that we ran the surveys in the spring of 2020, a decision was made to only run the staff surveys and not run family and student surveys in 2020. So we do have a gap in the data for that year for students and families. I think there was a few other things going on in the spring of 2020 and trying to minimize how many surveys we're putting out there and prioritize those. Go to the next slide. In addition to a sense of belonging, looking at interpersonal skills. And so when we put these potentially on a website, if sense of belonging or interpersonal skills was something that you wanted to highlight as a growth measure for the community, what we would do is work with you to put a narrative together that does a better explanation of what does interpersonal skills mean. That's a series of about 6 statements that students respond to. Same with sense of belonging. And so we would give you that summary that we could put on the website so people can see, have a better idea of this is what students are responding to when they're indicating this. And that's why sense of belonging and interpersonal skills connect to the culture of the school that you're trying to achieve with goal 1 within the strategic plan. So the next item is an example that I brought over from another district. Thanks to the pandemic, again, the discipline data from last year is fairly minimal, if anything, from Tukwila. But the way we broke this out is the blue areas at the top indicate the total percentage of the population that was disciplined, or total number of discipline cases. And then the orange on the top right indicate what percentage of those disciplines were serious disciplines that resulted in out of school suspensions and expulsions. We drove down below, you can see a breakdown by race and ethnicity that also does the disproportionality calculations, comparing the percentage of that population that was disciplined compared to what percentage of those students make up of the entire student population. So here with this district, you can see in 1819, 1920, you had Black students being significantly over-disciplined within the school system. Another chart that we put together for this district, which they found very useful, is in the upper right. And what you're seeing there is on the x-axis is the percentage of the population disciplined by school in each school. And then on the y-axis, it's a change in percent discipline from the previous year. So you would want to be a school that is down in the lower left that has a low percentage discipline and you're reducing your disciplines, as opposed to the district can very quickly highlight those two blue dots in the upper right and say, those are schools we need to talk to about what's going on. You're disciplining a high percentage of students and you're going the wrong way because you're disciplining more students this year than you did the year before. And just an example of how we can create some scatter plots in addition to the traditional bar graphs and other types of graphs to allow administrators to dig in and you to be able to monitor the district and share with the public how the district's doing. So that talks about some of the softer measures, the perceptual and the contextual data. If we go to the next slide, what you see is getting into more of the academic and achievement data. And I provide this as an example of when we mapped out what we wanted to put in the dashboard and we talk about district improvement plan and connection to the school improvement plan. On the left, you'll see all of the measures that we said as a district we wanted to create visualizations for. So that would be for the district strategic plan. And then if you wanted to overlay that down just to an elementary school, on the right are the indicators that are applicable for the elementary school. So you're really just stripping out those things that are the middle and the high school level. So you can use the same dashboard in essence for your school improvement planning as well as the district improvement planning. And ideally, this helps create greater consistency in that through line between what the district is focusing on and connecting that to what the individual buildings and ideally the classrooms are focusing on. So if you go to the next slide, one of those indicators is WA-KIDS. And here is a sample report from another district. We haven't gotten your WA-KIDS data for this year yet, so we haven't gotten that included. But as you can see, we break down the 6 different areas of WA-KIDS. We provide indications on what percentage of students scored at each of the levels on WA-KIDS. Then at the bottom, which is a very interesting indicator, is we can break it down by individual elementary school and then show where the kids scored as an average compared to the district average on each of those 6 elements. So here you can see the school at the bottom, all 6 elements were below the district average. The school in the middle, all 6 areas were well above the district average. So it gives, in this district, they put this on their website and share with the community of, this is what we have in the way of kindergartners coming into our system, and it helps justify this is why we may provide different resources to different buildings in our system because our students have different needs. If you go to the next slide, we also are able to break WA-KIDS out by race, ethnicity, as well as program enrollment, free and reduced lunch, ELL program, and gender. So that's something that they wanted to be able to share out with the public as well. So they put that on their website. The next slide is actually your data. So we've got your iReady data updated this year. Here you can see the grade level trends, kindergarten through 8th grade. If we were going to make this public, we would definitely want something on here indicating that 9th through 12th was not given to all students. Those are targeted students that use iReady. So that is not indicative of the entire student body. So things like that, when we get ready to go public with parts of this, that we'll make sure that it's very clear exactly what we're measuring and what we're sharing in those ways. If you go to the next slide, iReady data here is a look at the elementary schools. So you've got elementary school totals by year, broken down by elementary school, broken down by grade level. And here you can see circled in the middle is the toggle switch. So within the dashboard, you can switch between reading and math. and elementary and secondary schools. So you're able to kind of drill into a specific area. And on the next slide, we've got another tab that shows looking specifically at free and reduced lunch versus ELL or non-ELL students, giving you an indication. So again, this would be something that because we work with school data solutions, that we're able to update that pretty seamlessly once you close the window with that assessment. And it's not just iReady, it's any data that you put in school data solutions that we're able to access and pull that out. The next slide. I had this originally as a build-in slide because one of the things that we did is we really want to look at, we want to be able to get and access your grade book. And that's one of the key things that we need to pull. And by doing that, what we're able to do is look at how students are actually enrolling and completing in courses over time. So up in the top in the circle, you can see that we've worked with another district, and we worked with them to place all of their courses into one of several categories. So they can switch between core, CTE, ELA, elective courses, math courses. And here we've selected elective courses. In the district, when they saw this data, they took a look at it and said, wow, this is interesting. Our American Indian Alaska Native students, only 44.4% of our seniors are involved in any type of elective courses. Why is that? And that was a question they asked of the administrators, and they started talking about it. We flipped back and forth through a couple of these. And when we get to support courses, you'll find that in the support courses, your American Indian Alaska Natives are overrepresented. So they're taking remedial courses required for graduation that's preventing them from being able to take elective courses as seniors. And now that they're working through those conversations of what do we do as a system to try to make sure they have those opportunities and not prevent them by the way that we've built our schedules and have these set up, but preventing certain students from being able to access courses that other students can't. Again, you can see it also shows how many students are enrolled by grade level, by course, are able to dig into that. If you go to the next slide, that district also had a huge emphasis on grading equity, and they had a concern that they didn't think that they had equity in their grading practices. So we built this visualization based on the data we pulled from them, showing what percentages of students received A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's. And again, you can do the same selector by course type or all courses. Here you can see broken down by race and ethnicity. The length of the bar is proportional to the percentage of students out of the student population. So, you know, American Indian, Alaska Native are 0.8% of the students, and they make up 0.8% of the A's. So they're right at the neutral zone or gray. Whereas by being dark blue, your Asian Americans are almost 50% or over 50% overrepresented in the A's. Multiracial are underrepresented, and that's why they show up as orange. So the district now is able to go through and take a look and see, do we have areas that we really think there's some systemic issues with the way we do our grading practices that has impacted kids' grades, GPAs, and in essence, you know, maybe their ability to go on to secondary education or where they're going to go to secondary education. So it's driving some of those questions and discussions within the school system on how do we improve and how do we make sure we have an equitable system for all our kids. Next slide. I know I've been talking a lot, but I think I'm getting closer to being kind of through these to give you an idea of what we've got. Here we're looking at Tukwila graduation results. You should celebrate the improvement that you've seen over the last 4 to 5 years. I mean, that's a great improvement. And we're able to pull this straight off of your student data system, be able to create this and track this over time. And again, be able to disaggregate, if you go to the next slide, by race and ethnicity or by anything else that you would want to disaggregate by. Once we get the data into the system, it's really just a matter of a few clicks here and there, the way we can manipulate it to add in different disaggregations or different visualizations of this. It's pretty seamless. So We create, in essence, a standard template to make sure we get the data in there and it's accurate. And then once we get that set up, then it's working with the district on exactly how do you want this to look? What's the story you want to tell, and what's the best way to tell this through visualizations? Go to the next slide. The other thing we were able to pull in as well is post-secondary enrollment. We were able to pull this data and look at what percentages of students are enrolling in your 2-year and 4-year colleges. And then following the enrollment, the slide you're looking at now is showing remedial courses for students. So here you can see whether they've had to take any remedial course, English, math, or both English and math courses. Making sure you're looking at the same one I am. And so this is just looking at the overall student population, and the next one breaks that same data down by race and ethnicity. So as a whole, you're slightly above the state in the percentage of students taking remedial courses, on a good trend in 2018. Because this is data, not data that you provide or OSPI provides, it's always 2 years lagging on your graduations. So 2018, you actually dip below the state averages. When you go to the next slide and you're looking at race and ethnicity, you've got several groups of students that are well below the state average and several groups of students that are well above the state average. So again, looking at those, now your administrators would have that data at their fingertips to say, is there something that we're doing with certain groups of kids that's having to take more remedial courses when they get to colleges than other groups of students. The next slide, giving you an idea of attendance, looking at the blue being the overall percent attendance, and then the mauve color being what percentage of students are chronically absent or absent more than 10% of the time. And we have a selector so you can change how many days you base that on, whether it's based on 100 days of enrollment during the school year or 180 days. This one was set at 180 days, and you can see it also broken down by grade level, race, ethnicity, and which school they attend. One thing that we hope to include in the survey this year that we didn't last year is additional questions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And back in 2019, we did some research, settled in on the Harvard RIDES framework, and developed a supplemental question set for the educational effectiveness surveys based on that Harvard RIDES framework that delves into 4 component areas of equity and inclusion within schools. So with adding those questions in the upcoming EES survey this spring, we'll be able to do some visualizations around where the district sits, and even in comparison with, we've had many districts that have decided to start running or using that question set and getting feedback according to that framework. And then last couple slides of actual dashboard indicators. One of the things we look at is participation rates. And one of the things that we want to make sure is that all voices are being heard equally or equitably. And so we do a comparison of what is by race and ethnicity, what is the percentages of parents that completed the survey compared to what are the percentages of students. So do we have our parent response population looking like our student body? And monitoring that over time. Here you can see Asian parents went from overrepresented to underrepresented between 2019 and 2021. White parents were significantly overrepresented compared to students this last year as a percentage of the completion. But again, just things that you can dig into that we can then set goals on. Are we not providing this survey in a way that makes it easy for all parents to be able to complete it and provide their voice? Next slide. And the last 2 are family parent survey responses, similar to what we had for students, looking at parent and community involvement. and then communication and collaboration, which would be the next slide, which isn't much different than the other things that we've showed you. The next thing I wanted to share with you is on the next slide is a visual of our goal in this is not to create more work at the building level, at the central office level, or especially not at the classroom level. So ideally, what we're trying to do is take the data that's already being created by the teachers in the classrooms and pull that data up through the data systems and be able to create, in essence, a mosaic picture of the entire district using the pictures of every single classroom and every single student that you have in the district. So it's trying to focus on the school, the classroom, and the student view, all with the same data so that it's no more burdensome than what we already have in place. And it's picking what are those right measures. If you go to the next slide, it's really finding the right fit for Tukwila. So what are the data you already have that's available? What's going to fit the strategic plan that is generated to replace this strategic plan? And how are we going to monitor with that data and use that data for the betterment of the school? And that was a whole lot of me talking.
Thank you, Dr. Steach. I'm sure that the group has questions or ideas, things to share with you, so I'll open it up. Or not?
Just trying to figure out how to formulate it all. There's a lot going on up here. I think just first want to say thank you for taking the time to walk us through this. I really appreciate and value the transparency that this type of platform could really create for our community. I think that will be really, really valuable. I think, yeah, I'm so interested in the pieces around like the why. And you mentioned before, you know, we would take this data and then we as a group would kind of say, okay, what do we want to dig into a little bit more?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I'm just, I think it's great. I have a lot of questions about the data itself that we're seeing already. So it was hard for me to not dig into that. And hopefully, I'm sure, Mr. Howard, you recognize that in some of the questions I had, but so I'm really, really intrigued by how we can really utilize this to help support where we're going. So thanks.
My pleasure. Thanks for the positive comments.
You have questions, then the dashboard's doing its job, because that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to create the questions. This is the beginning. The hard work is then after the questions are generated, then starting to move it into the classroom and into the buildings. That's where the hard work starts. And all the what you've seen, principals have seen. They've seen this. You guys have, as directors, have provided this data to principals for the last 5 years. So they've seen this and they've been using this to develop their SIP plans, and now moving into the new direction of our strategic plan, you should see it be really correlated and responsive across the board. And that's what Dr. Herndon wants to see, that you see the district strategic plan and what the board has set as goals be definitely aligned with the building goals. And then you'll start to see strategies and supports in place and allowing voice to be talked about how we're going to implement it with our staff. And that should be interchanging. And that's why we want the flexibility with CEE to be able to adapt and change. And two other pieces I would add that Dr. Steach has started with us as well is the Leadership 360, which is measuring our principals' leadership skills. That's a big piece that we want to make sure so we can invest and support them and walk alongside them to develop. And then the other piece is the social emotional learning. That's a big piece that we have incorporated now that we are providing support thanks to our board directors and Dr. Herndon's vision. We can actually, with Ruler, we can start to support that practice. It's going to take 3 to 5 years to get to that point, but as we start to measure, we get a chance to see where we need to provide PD and support. So just wanted to add those other two pieces to this presentation because it's so key and so important, the social emotional and the leadership pieces that we need to provide for our principals to support them and walk alongside them so they can continue to develop as well.
And there were two things that I just wanted to chime in on quickly. One that I appreciate about this, again, that's not specific to the actual data, but one of the keys that I've seen in being in lots of different districts is that being able to collect the data and analyze it can often sometimes be one of the hurdles. So staff don't want to do double data entry. So if you're using different systems like discipline system or attendance system, and then whatever assessment you have, your grade book, like those are all different systems that are out there working. It's being able to pull all that stuff together and put it into one dashboard so that then you can kind of dig in and connect some of those dots. So oftentimes the classroom teachers themselves don't want a double entry. They just want to do one thing. If I'm doing in my student information system, if that's where the grade book is and attendance, I got to do that every day anyway. I don't want to have to do it again somewhere else. The other is the bandwidth within your own data teams that you may have. And that's what Dr. Steach was talking about. In a larger district, some of those districts have a whole team that just works on that. They work on data analysis and presenting that information out. But in smaller districts, they typically don't have that. And the last piece that I'll chime in on is that this is really a format or a vehicle that can take in whatever the data source may be. So if we change any of our assessments, this can change along with that because we're just getting the data. It doesn't matter what the assessment is. It doesn't matter if it's iReady or SBAC. It's whatever the data systems we feel are going to measure the progress that we have in there, whatever it may be. CEE is quantitative, but it's also qualitative. It's trying to tell some of that story because it gets to some of the feelings and perceptions that are in there. So what I enjoy about this is it's just a good vehicle for, I think, pulling in lots of different data sources, regardless of the other formats that they're coming in.
I have a very important question. Are you related to Ruth Steach?
Yeah, I'm Ruth's baby boy.
That's what I thought. Okay. She was a brilliant woman. And so it makes sense that you would also be an academic. I knew
Thank
Ruth
you.
a long time ago. She was one of my mentors. So, and I just want to say that, I'm a skeptic when it comes to data. I was taught early to be skeptical of data but I like the fact that you're inviting us to explore and to dig into it and not just take it at face value. Because one of the things I need to be able to explore is how you defined some things like belonging. What was the definition and how was that determined? And how were those questions, especially those first questions, how are they culturally sensitive? So I don't know if we get the opportunity to look at how those data points were determined by the questions that were asked and explore that with a race and equity eye or how that looks. I mean, the demographics are great. You're showing that, but it doesn't necessarily show the culturally sensitive part of it. So I'm sure that we will address that as we go along. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and we can easily provide the question bank and the constructs within those questions. Our original survey was developed over 20 years ago through the 9 characteristics of highly effective school study by OSPI that our fledgling company at that time participated in. And then that culture climate survey was used by OSPI under No Child Left Behind for school improvement work. And then in 2006, there was a King County study on social emotional learning. And that's what our SEL survey is based on, was that King County study from 2006 that we developed those items. And we've revised those on and off since then. I think we're on probably our SEL, I think we're on our 6th revision since then. But we'd glad to be able to provide those to you so you can take a look at it. And we're always looking for feedback from the districts that we work with and trying to improve.
So there's a huge amount of information here, and I'm trying to kind of digest it at a higher level. Originally, when I got this, I thought this was all our data, but you've clarified that some of it is our data and some of it's not our data. So that was some of it. I guess at a high level, I mean, I like the fact that you're backing this up to perceptual, contextual, and demographic. That makes a lot of sense to me, rather than going, straight down to the academic stuff. I mean, that's, I think, something we've been missing quite a bit with, I don't know, Dr. or Mr. Howard just talked about, the looking at how principals have looked at the CEE surveys over the years, but I don't think we haven't, at least as a board member, I haven't seen exactly how they're using some of that. So, but anyway, backing that up into that makes a lot of sense to me. I also like the fact that you're leveraging, the school data solutions homeroom investment that was made a number of years ago, and from my perspective, it kind of disappeared. I mean, we did it, we got some data out, and then it was kind of gone. So I thought, oh well, write that one off. And so I'm glad that's going to come back, and I know, and I particularly like, the fact that I know, I mean, I spend a lot of time on calls with other bigger, and all the districts around us are much bigger. And so they have full-time data staffs and all this kind of thing. And so the idea that we can, kind of benefit from an efficient data system where, we don't have the staff to spend a lot of time doing a lot of things that they do, that I think is a really good thing. And I love it when we leverage off the big guys. I love that because that's what we need to do to get some of that data. So anyway, I think that's great. I was a few items. First of all, I was curious about, you said our data was in the graduation rates, and I have never seen any of our graduation rates reported at 90%. So OSPIs, and I look at that really closely, obviously. I don't know where, I'm just kind of curious where the heck you got that data from, because I've never seen anything 90%.
So what we haven't done with your data is, which is why this isn't going public, is we haven't scrubbed it. And calculating graduation rates is not easy because you have to basically track your 9th grade class from the time they were created and make sure that you're taking account for where everybody ended up at the end. And so my guess is we may be off on the denominator because some of the way we build these is we actually get a student level report on demographics, and then we get all the other data we match up using the student ID. And so if we get something that's missing in the graduation report, kids that should be in that denominator, they would get dropped off. So before we'd ever publish this, we've got some more refining work that we've got to do to dig in. That's part of the reason that we're working with School Data Solutions, is because when I ask one district to give me a data file, it doesn't look like what another district would give me. And so I actually went to them last June and said, we really work well at the board, administration, principal level. School Data Solution works well at the teacher level. They have a teacher dashboard that is great for them to access, and principals maybe can use it. So that's what really formed the partnership. Is I wanted a way to consistently get accurate data every single time. That means I don't have to spend a bunch of time remapping all of the data files to make them fit into the visualizations, which then saves you money because you're not paying my IT guys to redo CSV files. So ideally, the way this works is we're able to pull that data seamlessly. We then just plug and play when it gets here, and then it greatly reduces the ongoing cost of maintaining these once we build it, because having been a superintendent and knowing what some of the budgets look like, you're not going to commit to some probably even 5-figure ongoing cost of maintaining a dashboard. So I figured I had to keep it down around $2,000 to $3,000 a year.
Yeah, there's nothing that drives me more nuts than when I see OSPI reporting one number for us on a graduation rate and then somebody else reporting another number. So hopefully that can get resolved. The other, let's see, I guess another kind of general question is, and you talked about, presenting this data and then drilling down into it with focus groups and different things. I'm wondering, I wonder about the whole approach of kind of surveys, and the multiple choice surveys, which CEA data, as my understanding is basically it is, in terms of a couple of things. One is, I mean, you talked about participation rates. Participation is one thing, but quality participation is another thing. And so I know a lot of our students, I mean, I've talked to, a lot of students get so many, I mean, they're tested out and surveyed out, and they'll just, I mean, they'll go through and blow something off and just, check. And so the question becomes, so that's kind of on the student side. And then my concern with this kind of approach is that it's the only approach. I mean, you can, multiple approaches, but with our families, we have, over half our families, English is not their first language, and I know you can translate, but then there's cultural issues. And the question is, how do you go about getting, quality data in these areas, particularly when you're talking about perceptual data and that kind of stuff, which as I said, I think is really important in terms of, students, engaging them in that process, and then also engaging our, multi-ethnic, multicultural families in that process. So that's kind of a concern I have. I don't know if you have a thought off the top on that.
On the multicultural, that's really, we try to work with the districts themselves and identify that through the participation rates and try to figure out what are the strategies. There's not one solution to that. It really is trying to target certain components. During the pandemic, there's been a lot of discussion about survey burnout, and McKinsey research came out with a report last summer on survey burnout. And what they identified was it wasn't length of survey, it wasn't number of times surveyed, it was lack of knowledge of what happens with the data. And so what my goal is working with Tequila is that we become very overt about here's what we're doing with the data. And every time we would give a survey, we should be out there sharing the results with people and saying, here's what we saw, here's a celebration, here's a concern, and on the concern, we want to know what the why is behind the concern and how can we dig in on this. If we start doing that on a regular basis, you're going to see people taking the surveys and taking them seriously because they know their voice is truly being heard. If we just give the survey every year and the families never see a word one about what happened with the results, I'm concerned that we're not going to get high quality results. We are trying something, we're piloting this year that we're breaking our survey up into 5 or 6 chunks and giving it every 6 weeks during the year, seeing if a 2-minute survey 6 times a year is easier to get through than a 12-minute survey once a year. And so we're piloting it with a district. We'll see how it works by the end of the year, and then we're going to reevaluate whether we want to recommend that to other districts or not. At most, I think we would try to expand it to maybe 5 districts next year if we decide that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think the feedback loop is a really important one. I hear that from students all the time. Is well, I mean, I took this survey and then I never heard anything. I mean, is anybody listening? That whole thing is, and that's true of families as well, I think. So I think you're right. That's a key thing. I guess the one other just general comment, I've been interested quite a while. Looking at the way you're talking about looking at iReady data or academic test data, it looks to me like you're measuring proficiency. And I'm just curious, I'm a big fan of growth data for a couple of reasons. One is because typically, people will compare like, okay, 3rd grade math scores versus last year's 3rd grade math scores versus this year's 3rd grade math scores, and use that as a differential. But of course, you're testing a wholly different set of students. So, I'm much more interested in students are growing also because, we have a lot of students that are, multi-grade levels behind. So it's critical when you get that multi-grade level behind, it's critical that you're growing them faster than just, 1 grade level or something like that. So I'm just curious what your and I know it's, I mean, iReady has some pretty good growth measures. I know there's a huge discussion, and I'll go into it here about student growth percentiles at the state level, but I'm just going to wonder what your thoughts are on, you know, looking at growth, student growth measures versus just straight proficiencies.
So I'm all for that. I agree with you completely, looking at individual student growth. And that's why having this connected to the individual student, then we're able to do that. As long as we've got it in the data. This was just the standard view that we created as a starting point. If we want to switch to growth, that's fine. Just like as an example, we had a district that, relative to that sense of belonging that we have in our survey, they wanted to know when kids go from elementary to middle and middle to high school, do they maintain that sense of belonging? So we created a special query within our own survey system to pull that data and give them cohort growth or change from 5th to 6th and 8th to 9th grade that they monitor on a yearly basis. And they talk about within the school system of, you know, what kind of an environment are we creating for the new kids coming in? So I not a problem with switching this over to growth, or even showing growth and benchmark side by side.
Okay, there's, I guess the last point I'll just throw in and you touched on it. Several of these were broken down by ethnicity. I also think it's really important for us to break it down by the groups, particularly ELL as students and special ed students. But yeah, you covered that one, so that can be done as well. So that's all I got. Thanks.
Dr. Steach, are there any districts utilizing the Healthy Youth Survey through the Washington State Department of Health and integrating that data?
For a couple districts that were facilitating strategic plans, they provide us with the Healthy Youth Survey, but we haven't integrated it within the dashboard yet. And
yeah,
part of that is because it's an anonymous survey. And because it's anonymous, we can't connect it to the individual student ID. So we could import it, but it would be just importing, basically recreating their visualizations. We wouldn't be able to do any additional disaggregations.
Yeah, I ask because in terms of bullying, student safety, sense of belonging, and longitudinal changes from grade level every 2 years, that's something that is, and I know that the data is broken down, of course, by district and then also building level. So it's building level data, it's not individual student data. Yeah. Even suicide risk, depression. I mean, like, so in terms of, that's what the Washington State Department of Health uses to sort of see what's going on with students. I just was curious if there were any districts utilizing that as well. I mean, they're utilizing it, but if they were somehow utilizing it with something like this, because I do see like there was some school level data presented, and I was curious about that.
We just don't have anybody using it yet. If that's something that you would want to do, we could work with the company to be able to get the data import and map it into a dashboard.
I had a couple other questions. I don't know, Director Larson, are you done? Or
Yeah, yep, I'm done.
Okay. My questions were related to access and transparency, and Director Larson had mentioned a little bit about the importance of why that's important. So, you know, in terms of access, do other districts post the data, or have, if say there's a school who's interested or a community partner, or, you know, they want to access the data, how is that controlled?
So there's really two versions of this. One that has all of the disaggregations that you can really drill in and dig into it. That's actually still connected to student level data. And therefore you have to get a Tableau's viewer license that gives us that security system. So what we do is we have each building gets one license, and the district office gets 1 or 2 licenses. And then you have basically a keeper of the data that can do the drilling in. For the website, what we do is we take the visualization itself and create an export to Tableau Public that we then create an embed code that goes to your web developer. So the end result is the community isn't going to be able to just drill into this and do all the functionality that the dashboard has. because behind the scene is the student level data that's supporting it every time you flip the switch to be able to redo the calculations and provide those visualizations. So that's got to be basically your administrators or people that you want specifically having that have the need to have access to student level data. That answer your question?
Are there other districts that do have a community view that can look at certain, I mean, are they utilizing it in that way?
Yakima School District has theirs on their website. And we're getting closer to the point of having it up on website with other districts. What we've just run into is, we've got some completed dashboards that districts are using. They just haven't had the horsepower and the time right now to worry about what their websites are looking like. They've been otherwise distracted. Every time we set a date to try to launch, they keep
Okay.
slipping the date on us.
Yeah. And related to what Director Larson was saying about participation and willingness to participate, it also ties to community trust. And so that if, in our community, that's already a challenge. I know that as a board, we discuss strategies and ways to acknowledge and honor feedback from the community. So looking at incentives and things like that. And I'm wondering, are there other districts who have done things like that?
We've talked to districts about, we can do a randomized raffle on who completes the survey. So we can provide some incentives like that. Outside, if you're talking specific to the survey, if you're talking more of just trying to get people together, when we work with districts on strategic planning, it's if you provide food, they will come, is what we constantly end up doing. So when we have a summit or focus groups, if we want to provide food and potentially childcare, then we're able to increase that participation. And also going to meeting people where they need to be met instead of expecting people to go to a school or a specific location. Of how do we define where do we want to hold the focus group that may be more accommodating to individuals.
I guess the last thing that I'll say is just more of a comment, and I'd be very interested in hearing the district thinking around which assessments, which data we want to continue using, what is maybe not so helpful, and if there are any thoughts, or will be any thoughts, doesn't have to happen now, about having a serious discussion about standardized testing. And actually maybe looking at how we do that and the impact on our students and the impact on our staff of what's happening in the classroom. Is there any areas of improvement? Are there concerns? Things like that. I've asked that question before and I haven't heard anything yet of what that is. I don't ask, and I hear it from the community what the concerns are, what the challenges are. I recently heard it from students who took the test and how challenging it is. And then also sort of the feeling defeated and feeling stupid afterwards. It's just, I just would hope that we are going to institutionalize further our standardized testing, right? If we decide to continue utilizing and depending on iReady data. And so I just throw that out there. It's a comment. Don't have to, just take it for whatever it's worth.
I think that's just part of the conversation about the strategic planning that will be coming up as we go through that. So
Okay.
Yeah, for sure, part of the conversation.
Yeah. And I know we're past the time of our advertised ending time for the meeting. Is there any last comments or anything like that? I want to make sure that if anyone else has anything else to say. Thank you, Dr. Herndon, Mr. Howard, and Dr. Steach for the presentation today.
Absolutely.
All right, so we can go ahead and move to adjournment.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.